Today is July 7th, 2022, and this is another oral history from the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting, along with producer Cliff Brockman. I'm Paul Yeager. Today, our guest is Dana Cardin, most recently of KCCI, and really, Dana, always of KCCI. You had a full career there. We'll get into all of that, but like every great Iowan, you're from Sheldon, Iowa. I mean, what is the deal with Sheldon?
I don't know. We seem to have a large number of people who have left and gone on and done something.
Just like you're like the wrestling coaches at the University of Iowa.
The Rance brothers, yeah.
Always good stories there. What was your dad born there, and that's how you ended up there? Or how'd you end up in Sheldon?
My dad was born in Sioux City. My mom in Sanborn, Iowa, which is about 8 miles away from Sheldon, and they ended up there. My dad worked for the phone company, and so that's where he was stationed. So I grew up, and he was a ham radio operator, and so I grew up with all these electronics and gizmos and stuff all over the place, which I think was a precursor to me getting into broadcasting.
Well, that's what I'm wondering. So you think were you interested in it, or was it just like, oh, it's dad stuff?
Well, no, I was interested in it because he would tear stuff apart all the time. And so I kind of liked figuring out how things worked and sometimes how they went back together. But he was also, back in those days, people having cameras wasn't all that common and usual. And so he was also, I don't know if he was a camera bug, but in fact, I still have his camera here that he would take pictures with, 35 millimeter. And I guess that kind of fascinated me more than anything, more than his ham radio work and all that. Because at some point I was grabbing different kinds of cameras and Instamatic. I was taking pictures of everything. My sister still makes fun of me because I would take pictures of maps and just anything that was around, and just to take pictures. So that's kind of how I developed an interest in photography.
So that visual side of things was launched early, and then you enlisted in the Navy before college, or do I have them reversed?
Before college, right out of high school.
So is that what you wanted to do in the Navy when you enlisted, or how did that work out?
Well, I kind of have a family history in newspaper business. My grandfather and aunt owned the small newspaper, the O'Brien County Bell in Primgar, Iowa. And so Grandpa would bring me down to his basement dark room and show me how to process film. And I would later kind of do some of that with my aunt after my grandfather died. And I kind of did some freelance stuff for the local newspaper, the Sheldon Mail Sun. And I did some stuff for the radio station there, KIWA. So I kind of had a little bit of a background in it. And I had an uncle in the Navy. He said, "Oh, you ought to go into the Navy." I go, right. Because it was at the tail end of Vietnam. And, really going into war isn't something that I think you want to do, although sometimes it's the right thing to do. So I went to my Navy recruiter and said, "I want to become a Navy photographer." And he laughed and said, "That's such a popular thing for people to get into." He says, "There's no way we're going to get you into that." I said, "Okay, well, how about being a Navy journalist?" And he also laughed and said, "There's no way." Oh, wait, there's an opening. So into the Navy school, which was the Defense Information School. People refer to it as DINFOS. I'm now an official DINFOS trained killer, is what they call people who have graduated the course. And so that's how I got into. I went initially to become a photographer, and then they said, "Well, we'll have you be a print journalist." And then at that time, the Navy said, "We're going to put TV stations aboard a lot of the ships." And so everyone who was at DINFOS at the time suddenly became broadcasters, and they went through the broadcast version of the training there. And so that's how I got into the broadcasting part of the journalism world.
Do you have any memorable stories of your time as a journalist in the Navy?
Yeah, there were a number of things. I think one of the more fun things was kind of combine the journalism and the photography part. Is one of the ships that I was on, we had two of the helicopters with the double props on the Chinooks. And every now and again, I'd hear over the intercom system, journalist Dana Cardin report to the flight deck. And so I'd grab my camera and we would go up in the helicopter and they'd open up the floor, essentially. They called the hell hole. They would strap me in and we would go over Russian trawlers or sometimes a Russian frigate. And I would just hover over and take pictures of spy work. So you would see the antennas that they had on their ships, and we would ship them off to somebody somewhere who could tell what exactly was going on.
Dana Cardin, international spy.
Right. Yeah.
You're the inspiration for James Bond. Different kind. You get out of the Navy and end up at Iowa State. Why Iowa State?
Well, I don't know. I really don't have a good reason why I went to Iowa State. They had a respectable journalism program, and that's what I knew I wanted to continue doing. And so I started going to Iowa State, and I mean, it seemed like within days, this guy named Jack Shelley, who was my advisor, came up and said, "Danny, KCCI is looking for a part-time person. I think you'd be perfect to go apply for that job." And so what Jack Shelley said, I did. I went and I did the interview with Paul Rhodes, and a day or two later he called up and he offered the job, and I almost turned it down. I said, "Well, I've been out of school for a while and I really should focus on my studies." "Oh, what the heck. Yeah, I'll do it." And so I started part-time there while I was going to school at Iowa State. That lasted for 2 years. And then 2 years later, Russ Van Dyke retired, creating a position for them to hire me just as I was graduating. So that's how I went from part-time to full-time. And I tell people now that I replaced Russ Van Dyke.
And you know what? There's no better story than that to say how you replaced Russ Van Dyke. What year was this?
That would full-time would have been 83.
83.
Yeah.
So at the time, 83 in Iowa, we're warming up for a couple of big stories. Farming and the economy are kind of starting. Do you remember what some of those early stories were?
Yeah, there are a lot of them. There were all the gatherings of farmers, and they're not really protesters, but rallies. There's not really a good word for it, where they would show up and they would plant the white picket fences for all the Iowa farms that had gone under. A number of Iowa banks started failing, and so we did a lot of stories on that. And it was a rough time in the state, and telling those stories so people understood the pain and suffering that Iowa farmers went through was utmost in our mind, to make sure that people understood just how dramatic this was and how much of a sad story it was for Iowa farmers.
At the time, TV crews in Des Moines, Iowa, I'm guessing, were still reporter, photographer. Were you right at the tail end of maybe an audio person was with you, or was this on film, or was this videotape?
It was all on videotape. I started as what we called a one-man band then, like a multimedia journalist now, both shooting and reporting. But then as soon as I went full-time, I became a full-time reporter. And so we did not have an audio person, but we were still connected with a cable between the camera and the record deck that I would often kind of carry. And so we had this umbilical cord that kind of, joined us together.
And were you based in Ames then? Was that the beginning of like the Ames Bureau, or were you based out of Des Moines?
I was based out of Des Moines. Ames would come a number of years later.
Okay. General assignment reporter means you could be doing a farm protest one day, flooding the next.
Yeah, always had a change of clothes. Never knew if you're going to be in the governor's office or in the middle of a muddy farm field.
Yeah, that's the joy of it, right?
That was fun. I had this, and speaking of muddy farm fields, the Iowa Farm Progress Show was going on in Boone, and we had deluge of rain, and it was a mud bog. I mean, I remember walking out to the trailer that they had set up at the Iowa Farm Progress Show, and up to knees in mud trying to walk out there. And as I'm walking up and knocking on the door and stepping in to talk to them, the lady sitting at the desk goes, "Oh, I know you. You're the person they send to places where no one else wants to go." Well, today you're absolutely right.
Yeah, Well, good to know your reputation was cemented at that point, or mudded at that point, I guess.
Mudded, yeah.
And that Farm Progress show would not be the last year that they would have mud up to your ankles or knees. It seems to be every other time it's in Boone that happens. Other stories that you recall, because 83, we're getting right to the point where a couple of carriers go missing for the Des Moines Register.
Yeah, Johnny Gosh, still makes me sad every time I start talking about this, is Dave Buzik, who would later become the news director, but was a weekend anchor, was leaving church and noticed a commotion going on the street corner in West Des Moines and stopped to see what was going on. They said, well, a newspaper boy is missing. And so, we didn't have cell phones then, so he had to go find a phone. He called me in the newsroom and we started doing the first story on Johnny Gosh vanishing. And about an hour later, I was in the Gosh's home getting a picture of Johnny Gosh, so we would have something for our story. And knowing little then that his vanishing would take so many different dramatic turns and twists up till today, in fact.
And is that a relationship then with his parents? I mean, I know that Noreen has done, countless interviews over time, but as a young journalist at that time, but you had world perspective too, a little different than maybe today. But and it's the backbone of your station, really, I feel, the relationship that a reporter has to have with the family. Tell me how you approached, and if you knew what you were even approaching of a sensitive situation with a family that, of course, you didn't know how it was going to end, and it hasn't ended. But
Right.
how do you do that as a reporter and then later teach that to other reporters?
Well, I think it's always hard. I think developing that relationship with your viewers or readers, listeners, is so important. I mean, that day I was still a part-time kid at Iowa State and no one knew who I was. And so it was just a real brief meeting. But we would go on years later talking with Noreen and her husband, John, and just developing a relationship. Sometimes it was tense relationship. And sometimes, I think the last time I spoke with her, she was coming in to do an interview on one of the anniversaries. And even though I wasn't involved with that, I just sat down and chatted with her for a while and kind of, just talking about the past and how things went and how things should have gone. And I think that just helps us all kind of deal with our feelings over the whole thing, her in particular.
Well, it's an intrusive thing to take a camera
Right.
into someone's home.
It is, but I think being an Iowan really helps. Coming from a small town, and I mean, it's what we do all the time, is help other people out, even though that wasn't my job as a journalist to help directly. It was my job as a human being to feel compassion for the family and to relay that, as the stories are told about a family who's missing one of their children.
And as a person who ended up with, decades of experience, how, we'll get to your official assistant news director role, but how do you see that as teaching the next crop of journalists that came through? How did you see what you had to do and pull from experiences like that to make sure that a new reporter who came into your station would embody what your station was about?
I think one of the things that I learned, it's about leadership. It's about just being a human being. Is I've started picking up in the Navy, is like people think, you're in boot camp, you're yelling at everybody all the time, when really that's not what leadership is. It's building a team. And so, when the worst happens, you're all on the same mission, doing the same thing, working together rather than at odds with each other all the time. And I think that helped in the military. It helped as a reporter, is that I never felt this adversarial role with people. whether it was, a farmer that I was talking to, or whether it was a politician. It's just like, I can ask you tough questions. I don't have to be a jerk about it. And the same thing as a manager. It's just like, I may have to have a difficult conversation with you, but I don't have to be a jerk about it. I don't have to be disrespectful of it. And so I think that comes from being in Iowa and just learning from smart people. I had a great boss over most of my career at KCCI, Dave Buzik. I learned so much from him every day as being a reporter, being a manager, and being a human being.
Well, I'm looking at your list here of people and thinking what you've said so far about names. You mentioned Jack Shelley, Russ Van Dyke, Paul Rhodes, Dave Buzik. I mean, these are 4 very impactful Iowa journalists and Iowa people too.
Well, just imagine being a young kid, my first day at work, which happened to be April 1st, by the way. I'm not reading anything into that. Showing up, and there's Russ Van Dyke, Paul Rhodes, Dave Buzik, Pete Taylor, Connie McBurney, Mary Brubaker, Mike Reynolds, Rick Frederickson, another veteran broadcaster, Rob Davis, and then Kevin and Molly Cooney. I mean, I would share the same office with Kevin Cooney for more than 20 years, and I survived. But I mean, it's just like a hall of fame walking into the newsroom at that time. And it's just like, I knew then that I wasn't the smartest person in the room, and I was never going to be the smartest person in the room. And so I did what I could, and I tried to learn as much as I could from all of them. It was just an awesome experience, and just realizing, looking around going, it's like I hit the jackpot.
Well, how did that team all get assembled? Does anybody get credit for one person in particular in turning that over? Is that just a generational thing?
I don't know how it all got started. I'm going to put my finger on Paul Rhodes and said that he was probably the most instrumental in bringing those people together at that time. I mean, Russ was near retirement, and Paul was the main guy who was kind of pulling all the strings and making the machine work. And it was such a great group of young professionals who were serious about what they did, but not about themselves. They were not the typical broadcast people that you think of when you think of the movies and the stereotypes. And I think a lot of Iowa broadcasters are. They're community service oriented, and that's their focus, not how their hair looks. So.
Right. Oh, sorry.
Well,
what
I made
year
a career
were
out
you?
of TV with this
Come on
hair,
now,
so
Dana. Now that's not fair. You can't throw that at us. That's management hair right there. Is that what you're saying?
Thank you.
What year did you make the flip from general assignment reporter or reporter to management?
It was in the late 90s. I forget the exact year, 95, 97-ish.
Okay, so then we need to cover up a little bit of ground then as a reporter too before we get to that management. So
Okay.
1993 in Iowa is going to be known still forever as the year of the flood, whether it was in Davenport. Des Moines had a pretty big series of stories, no water for days, no roads blocked all over the place, people flying in helicopters. What do you remember of the floods of 93?
It was such, I mean, it was just 24/7 of going and trying to tell the stories and keep it all in perspective. It's difficult sometimes you get focused in on just this little area, and that's all everybody knows about it, and trying to get the wide view of what was going on, not just in Des Moines, but in other parts of Iowa as well, particular eastern Iowa, and keep that perspective in mind. But I mean, Des Moines had, because of its location and stuff, it became kind of, in fact, one bridge on Fleur Drive, which was near where the waterworks plant was, that became flooded and we lost water. We're kind of ground zero for the national media and politicians and stuff, because it was convenient to the airport. It was just down the road from the airport and getting in. And so we had this scene where there were hundreds of people sandbagging to help protect the waterworks plant from more damage and more flooding. And so it wasn't unusual to look around and see Dan Rather, reporting on in 48 hours, or President Bill Clinton to be down shaking hands with the sandbaggers. And we were doing continuous live reports from there. And at the time, kind of one funny story out of the whole sad situation is my photographer, Tim Bloomquist, and I were on the bridge as people were doing sandbags, and we had a microwave transmitting unit powered by a station wagon. And so at some point during our live reports, the car died. And so our live equipment died. And so I was going around to anyone I could see that had a car. Do you have a jumper cable? Do you have a jumper cable? And this one woman came up to me and said, is there anything I can help you with? It looks like you're looking for something. I said, well, I'm really in need of a jumper cable if you have one right now. And she goes, well, I'm with the Red Cross. I can get you a meal. I can get you someplace to sleep. I can get you a blanket. I can't get you a jumper cable. And at that point, I thanked Elizabeth Dole, the head of the American Red Cross, for offering me all that stuff, and that she didn't have a jumper cable. So I'm walking away going, I just asked Elizabeth Dole for jumper cables. I mean,
Dana, if you don't ask, you should know this. You're never going to get the answer. You have to ask the question at least.
I know. Well, they had their Red Cross IRV right there. It's just like, you don't have jumper cables? Come on.
But it's now in all their packs, right? Yeah.
I hope so.
Standard policy.
Yeah.
So you have jumper cable story. One of your competitors at the time was known for flying in a helicopter and yelling things out. I think you have your own helicopter story from the floods. Do I understand?
Well, not that particular flood, but in the late 80s, one of the first times that Saylorville Lake got brim full and was at that time threatening to go over the emergency spillway, someone at the station had the bright idea of going, well, we just have this little microwave unit. Why don't we put that in a helicopter and go above Saylorville Lake? And of course, the guy who they send places no one else wants to go, suddenly was at this helicopter out in a farm field. It was a crop duster, the kind of helicopter that you see in MASH, a little bubble on it, maybe room for 2 people. So here I am with the microwave transmitter tucked under my legs, under the seat, the pilot to my left, and my photographer, Tim Bloomquist, to my right. So we had to go up in the helicopter and point the microwave dish right at the receiver in Alleman. And then we had the full Saylorville Lake all below us. And just about, we were ready to go on the air, and it was all working. It was kind of fascinating. I see my photographer, Tim Bloomquist, as he's turning the camera around. I look down and I see his seatbelt dangling, flapping in the wind. Tim, you might want to put that on. And
Don't lean,
turned
Tim.
like 3 shades of white, and he goes, I grabbed his camera so he could put the seatbelt on, and we all lived to tell about it. Bright ideas.
Also in the late 80s, you had another road trip that you took to eastern Iowa, and your face reappeared here recently on your former station. You were over in the Dyersville and Dubuque area. There was this tiny movie, which at the time was seen to be a tiny movie. It wasn't a blockbuster. It wasn't a major thing, but it was still a big deal. We had a movie in Iowa. You were at the Field of Dreams movie. At the time, though, it wasn't called Field of Dreams.
No, it was called Shoeless Joe after the book. And we were invited to spend the day with the crew shooting the movie. So I spent a day with Kevin Costner as they were shooting a scene in Dubuque for the movie. It's a scene that never made the movie, but it was fascinating to be there with Kevin Costner and the whole production crew and watch that. They later named it Field of Dreams because it was a much better name than Shoeless Joe. So it was a great experience. Kevin Costner was like the nicest guy the entire day that we were there. We weren't supposed to interview him, but being the snoopy reporter that I am, I said, Mr. Costner, can we have a couple words with you? And he said, oh, absolutely. So he sat down and talked with us, as all of his handlers, I always called the movie weasels, shot his daggers for daring talk with their star. But he was great, and he deserved to become a star in my mind.
And at that, the Weasels were later chastised probably by Costner. Why'd you let this guy through? You know, that's not your problem. You have the interview on tape.
No, he was more than willing to sit down and talk to us. He had no problem with it.
Yeah.
And that's the case, I think, in most things, is that they have the interference runners, but the people themselves are great.
At the time, when you're in Dubuque, that wasn't uncommon for you to be traveling around the state of Iowa. How, in an era where it's local news, how is it that you ended up going to all sorts of corners of the state to report?
Well, the KCCI has a tradition of having feature reporters. Kevin Cooney covers Iowa. He would travel the state doing stories about Iowans in Iowa. Rick Swalwell would do that, and it's just been a tradition. Eric Hansen does it now. And I lived in Pleasant Hill, and every morning when I would drive to work around this one year during Christmas time, there was this little weed growing up in the median. One day someone put a Christmas ball on it. A day or two later, there'd be some tinsel, and it just happened every day. And so at one point I grabbed a camera and went out and shot this thing and did just a short little, 20-second anchor read on it. And it was after that ran, Paul Rhodes came up to me and said, "You're going to be our next feature reporter." What? And so it wasn't that long after that they, formally said, we want you to become our feature reporter and travel around the state. And I remember John Pascuzzi, who was a program manager at the time, came up and goes, "Well," and I think, Paul, you relate to this. He said, "What do you want to call it?" And I go, "Well, I would love to call it the Iowa Journal." And he goes, "All right, great. Iowa it is."
So in one ear, translate out another, not anything
Right.
here and here didn't match.
Thanks for asking, John.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, you were supposed to feel good about being asked by by John.
Yeah. And so I went for the next 15-ish years with this franchise, Eye on Iowa, where I would travel to hundreds of Iowa towns and most Iowa counties and around the country and even overseas once in a while, telling the stories of Iowans. And, my definition of feature reporter and other people's definition of a feature story are two different things. A lot of people say, well, it's a feature story. To me, I think for a lot of people think a feature story is something, big wheel races or something which really don't have a lot of impact. To me, the idea of being a feature reporter is telling about how people live, why they do what they do, and who they are as a people through the activities that they do. So it's not about the big wheels, it's about the person who wanted to do the big wheel race in order to raise money for someone who was in need. That's the story, not the big wheel races. And so my definition of a feature report or feature story, feature reporter, is someone who gets deeper into the why and the character rather than they're doing a big wheel race.
Yeah, I mean, the big wheel race is good visuals in a
Right.
sense, but again, at the heart of a good story in whatever form is still a good subject.
Right. So it's really about
character development.
The storytelling, and the storytelling is always based on the character of the person and who they are and why they do it. And that's what's interesting about it, not exactly what they do necessarily.
Well, back on my time on the board at the Iowa Broadcast News Association, we'd get reports of how many people entered those categories, and feature was always the most popular because everybody thinks they could do it, but only certain ones could do it really well. And you've named many of them. I think of, Kevin Cooney, and then later Steve Carlin takes over. And I guess you must have ran out of people with a K and a C in their name to hire at KCCI, because Eric Hansen kind of is close, but and then Eric Hansen. And there's, again, that DNA of the station's storytelling. So you're saying that a little bit of management has helped foster some of this over the years in nurturing. Like, who gave you good feedback to help you maybe be a better storyteller?
That's hard to answer, but I think it was Paul Rhodes who gave me the permission to develop my own style, to make my own mistakes, and to try different things, and let me use those to grow my own style, rather than trying to be like everyone else, trying to be what I think a broadcaster ought to be. You get down your
I
deep
say,
voice,
give me your voice. Yes.
your voice, and you write the who, what, when, and where. He gave me the permission to not do that. And that was the biggest thing ever. And so I've always tried to carry on that tradition with people. It's just like, don't try to write like me, or don't try to write like Charles Kuralt, or whoever your hero in broadcasting is. Learn from their styles, but learn how to write as yourself, your own style. And I think that's the secret to Eric's success. I think that's the secret to anyone's success who, even if you never broadcast a story, if you just sit down and write a story, writing it in the way you want to write it is the key to salvation when it comes to just creative writing. And yeah, that's always been important to me, to when people would come up and say, well, help me with this story. And it's like, you help yourself with this story. I can give you some tips, I can give you some feedback, but you have to learn how to write the story as yourself. And that was the most important thing I tried to pass along to new reporters.
Well, and I think that there's probably a good crop of them. The way you write is kind of the way you are in person. I get the sense from your stories that was Dana Cardin. Knowing Eric Hansen, that is Eric Hansen. I think of Andy Fales at WHO at this time. That's Andy, his style. So I guess that's important to have. So now the hardest question, Dana, you have to pick one of your favorite stories that you went on. You have to pick a favorite child here.
I can pick a lot I don't like.
What made one that you didn't like? We'll go there.
I wish I never did that one. What's that?
I'll ask you that first. What story didn't you like to tell?
I did a story on Hootie Hoo Day. Exactly.
I try to be well versed in a lot of things. I'm lost on that one. You stumped me.
Well, Hootie Hoo Day is like, it's this day, and I don't know I don't remember the background in it, but it's kind of saying goodbye to winter, and you get out and you welcome spring by yelling Hootie Hoo. I don't know why. I explained it a little bit in the story. I try to block it out of my mind. But I did a lot of things where I myself went and yelled Hootie Hoo. That's a point where reporter involvement was probably not well advised. Anyway, the story is okay. I just grimace looking at it whenever I see it, and people are sure to show it to me every now and again. Now, my favorite story.
All right.
Courtney Kinser, photojournalist extraordinaire, and I went to Cruston, Iowa one night, where they had an old gymnasium that it was going to be their last basketball game. The gymnasium was called the Pit, and it was, one of those old, awful gymnasiums where they had all these pillars and posts where you really couldn't have a good shot or a good view of the basket. They had a balcony around there where you could see one basket, but you couldn't see the other hoop. And it was small and noisy, and this was going to be their last game. And so we just told the story of the Pit through the eyes of the various generations who had played there, and who had played for the coach, because it was the most important thing that they did as kids is to make the coach proud of them. And it had so many reflections on life, and it gave life to this building through the eyes and the experiences of the people there. And it just turned out extremely well. And we just did a quick turn on it, but it's a story that I always point to as being, that's what broadcast journalism stories can be.
You mentioned, I think, part of it as well when you said Courtney Kinser, the station of photojournalists that you had at KCCI. You want to talk about Murderers Row? I mean, you've had some incredible talent. NPPA station of the year, plural.
Years, lots, yeah.
Such an incredible staff that I've gotten to know. and watch their work, how important is the visual? Let's go all the way back to that camera that's sitting there right off your right hand. How important is the visual in a story?
It's a secret ingredient to television. Our staff of photographers has always been extraordinary, not just their ability as photographers, but their character as people, and their passion that they have for their craft is just second to none. Made my job as a feature reporter like easy. I would just have to sit back, look at the pictures that they would take, and write to the pictures. This is easy. You guys are doing the hard work for me. And but we would have, the discussions on what the story is. We would know, what we wanted to do. This is going to be the ending, and these are the shots. And we just have this ongoing conversation about the visuals of the story, not necessarily the words. And I just have to write, a couple sentences, and the story was told. But I'll tell you this, is that there were a couple times during my career at KCCI where I had the opportunity to go elsewhere. One of them, I would have stayed in town, but would have been a job in public relations, and I was struggling on what to do. Leave the job that I love, do this other thing for new opportunities. And that night we had a dinner for the staff, for the photographers, for winning one of their NPPA Stations of the Year things. And as we went through and watched their stories and listened to their own stories, and it just struck me as like, I cannot leave this family. And so that was the answer, is just being around these people. It's just like, they're the hardest working people in broadcasting, in my opinion. And without them, it's just very difficult to see how you can tell stories with just average pictures. And I never had to learn that, because we always had such great photographers, and I give them 79.89% of the credit of just being able to bring back great pictures that I just had to write to.
You make the transition into management, so I would imagine that group was pretty easy to manage.
They were always my favorites. You're not supposed to have favorites, right? But photographers were always my favorites. Because I have a photographer background, and I just really respect the talent that it takes to do it well. And plus, they were just super people. I mean, they're my friends now. We still get together. We get together with WHO photographers too. It's like we don't divide lines. It's just like we're a small community of comrades, and we still get together and tell war stories.
There's always a few to tell. Remember that one time?
Yeah.
What was the job like as assistant news director? What were you kind of in charge of?
I was in charge. My official duties was to handle the day-to-day operations of the newsroom, while Dave Buzik was in meetings and plotting the future of the station. I'd made sure that the news got on the air every day, and what stories we're going to tell and how we're going to tell them. That was my official thing. I learned in the Navy from one of the executive officers on one of the ships is, as being the second guy, is that you have two jobs. One is to make sure that the ship is ready to go to war. So always made sure that the newsroom was ready to cover stories. And the second one was to make sure that the captain looked like he walked on water. And so I took those two responsibilities seriously. But with Dave, it really wasn't. It was keeping up with Dave as he was walking across the lake. That he was the greatest boss to have, and I think one of the greatest people I've ever known. So,
is a reporter different from the 1980s to 2020, 2022? Is there a difference in those reporters?
What they have to do is a lot different. I mean, we went out and we told a TV story. Now you have social media, you have Facebook Lives, you have all these other responsibilities that you have to try to do. And you have a lot more newscasts than we ever did. So I think the job is a lot harder than it was when I was a cub reporter. They don't have as much time to go out and just have conversations, to go out and take a source to lunch. I mean, they just don't have time to do that the way we did. And it's both good and bad. I mean, they reach a larger audience in many ways through different forms of media. But it is a lot different in that regard. But it's also very much the same in how you sit down and you tell the story of about, you know, what happened, how the people were impacted. So a lot of differences, but at the very basics of what we do, it's still the same, I think.
You've had always a great stable of people come through. And those that move on to pretty big places. I think of, you know, whether it's just name the market, there's probably an alum. But you've had a few people stick around. Is the station still the same in corporate ownership like it is today versus what it was, still supportive of what you're referring to, and why it takes time? And maybe you can't turn 8 stories in a day. You can only turn 4.
It is different in that regard. When I was a reporter, we either had local owners who just, you guys are doing what you ought to be doing, we're going to leave you alone. We've always had good owners, people who were focused on journalism, and I'm always appreciative of that. Whether it was Kohl's Communications, whether it was H&C Communications, Pulitzer, or now Hearst, is that they were in the journalism business. They weren't investors who owned a chocolate company and razor blades and, oh yeah, by the way, we have some TV stations. They were very big on journalism, doing it the right way. You know, if we're going to make money, we're going to make it by investing in the product and not cutting the costs to make money. And they were able to bring great resources to us that we wouldn't have been able to do on our own. And I've always respected that. But at the end of the day, there's still a corporation. There's still people who are making decisions who don't live here. And that goes, I'm an Iowan, and that small town Iowan who had, you know, grandfather aunt in a small town. And what happens in that individual town is different than happens in the town next to it. And you have to, I think, report that way and react that way. And sometimes that is not the case under corporate ownership, is that they try not to treat every station the same, but in many ways they do. And I think that's one of the dangers. Even though we have very good owners, Hearst is a great, and I respect all the people there. It's just kind of the built-in thing of a corporation, I think.
You're still talking in present tense, but that's past tense now. Why retire now?
There are a lot of reasons. I try to look back when I was a young reporter, and the old guys would retire, and I would go, I respect everything that you did. Thank you for the chance for me to spread my wings and let me do what I want to do. I just felt it was time for me to do that same thing. Get the heck out of their way and let them take the baton. I don't want to be out. I'm not out of the race. My what do they call it? My lap. I'm not a sports person.
I'm waiting for you. I'm trying to help you. Okay. Yeah, we're running. Okay.
My lap was done. Here's the baton. I still in the race. I just have to stand off the side and watch you run. And that's kind of how I feel right now. So it was my time to hand them the baton and let them do their race and get this team to the finish line. And so I just felt an obligation to do that. And after the last few years, the pandemic and all that, it's just like, all right, now I truly have done it all. I gotta go.
Well, think of all the journalism done this way, via Zoom, recording on a computer screen. It allows you to both be connected, but not to travel. You get that person, maybe you get that source for a story that's in Omaha, and you don't have to call your sister station to help you out with that interview. You can do it yourself.
Yeah, there are some pluses to it, Paul, but to me, I think the purest form of what we do as journalists is to go out on a bar stool, on a church pew, on a park bench, and talk to people and say, what's your story? What's this all about? And just have a conversation with them face to face. I think that's the purest form of what we do. And then we write what they say. And if we ever forget how to do that, then I think we suffer because of that. I think my favorite times as a reporter was going out without anything in mind and just going out and looking for stories and talking to people and say, what's going on? What's happening? Why are you doing this? You know, I just don't hope we never miss that. In fact, if I were to put a newsroom together today, everyone who worked in the newsroom would have been that person sitting on the park bench, on the bar stool,
Yeah.
and having that experience, because I think that just really brings it home of what we try to do every day, is tell the stories of the people and how life impacts them.
Well, and frankly, Dana, you still have to be able to, and I talk about this with others, you still have to be able to look them in the eye and do fair work. People will respect you if you are fair. People don't respect you when you swoop in, whether it's Dan Rather and the other national news herd that comes in and stands on the bridge and might only get just a tiniest bit of the story. But you're the one who has to pick up the damage, and you're the one that is going to be in the grocery store that you pass. I still, I tell this to myself is, can we still have a chat after we're done and the story airs? Was I fair to you? And I think we call it respectful and we can move on.
Right. I think the
There's
highest
no question in there. Sorry, I just.
Well, no, but I think the highest compliment that I ever got from anyone who says, the story that you did on me was completely accurate. It's like, well, it's supposed to be,
Yeah.
but it was just like a great compliment just to say it was accurate. I don't know if that was their backwards way of saying, well, yeah, it was accurate, but no. But I think their intention is that it was a complicated story and you got it right. And I think that's because we sit down and we have a conversation.
And the last part of our conversation is going to be what's next for you.
I'm going to get back into photography. The very first thing I wanted to do when I started this and got diverted away. So my camera is a little bit different now than the one that my dad did. This is my camera today. I love drones.
Oh, a drone.
Drone photography. So we've gone from one extreme, a little Argus 35 millimeters to that. And I love the photography, and I love the gizmos and the gadgets of being able to go out and fly. So photography, getting back to where I started.
Well, fantastic. Dana Cardin, I loved hearing your story and all the years there at KCCI. And after, you moved to that management role, you still had a hand in a whole lot of stuff we saw and consumed. So your fingerprint's going to be there for a while.
Well, again, I hope people take it and make it their own.
Very good.
And as one Iowa Broadcast News Association past president to another, I've got my ceremonial gavel. We can bring this interview to
This interview is adjourned. This has been a production of the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting. Cliff Brockman is our producer. Dana Cardin was our guest today. I'm Paul Yeager here on the 7th of July, 2022. Dana, thank you so much.
You're welcome.